Welcome to the Sleeping Archive, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it.
October 12th, 1605. My name is Joan Rennett, and I have always been a woman who notices things, small things, the way dust settles differently when someone has been where they shouldn't, how a man's voice changes when he's telling half-truths, the particular silence that falls over a room when secrets are being kept. Perhaps it comes from 30 years of keeping house, of making do with little, of watching my husband Thomas work his way up from nothing to become keeper of the Undercroft beneath Parliament. Or perhaps it's simply that when you're a woman of my station, you learn early that your survival depends on seeing what others miss. I tell you this because what I'm about to share, what I witnessed in those final weeks before the 5th of November, it still haunts my dreams. Even now, 20 years hence, I wake in the dark hours wondering if I could have done something different, if I should have spoken sooner, if my silence made me complicit in what nearly came to pass. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the morning I first noticed the changes. It was a Tuesday in October, the kind of grey London morning where the Thames mist clings to everything like wet wool. I was in our small kitchen above Fawkes' lodgings on Pudding Lane, preparing Thomas's breakfast of porridge and small beer, when I heard the first set of unfamiliar footsteps crossing the courtyard below. Thomas had left before dawn, as was his custom, to unlock the Undercroft and inspect the premises before the day's activities began. The Undercroft, you understand, was part of the old Palace of Westminster, a vast cellar space that had once stored the royal household's coal and timber. When Parliament needed additional storage for their records and supplies, they leased it to Thomas for £8 per year. It was good money for a man of his standing, steady work that kept food on our table and a roof over our heads. But those footsteps, they were wrong somehow. Too careful, too measured. Not the heavy, honest tread of workmen or clerks, but something more deliberate, more furtive. I set down my wooden spoon and moved to the small window that overlooked the yard. Through the thick glass, wavy with age and bubbles, I could make out two figures in dark cloaks moving toward the Undercroft entrance. One was tall and lean, the other shorter but broader through the shoulders. They spoke in voices too low for me to catch words, but their heads were bent together in the way men's are when they're planning something they don't want overheard. The shorter man produced a key. Thomas's key, I realized with a start, and unlocked the heavy wooden door. They disappeared inside, and I stood there for a long moment, my heart beating faster than it should have been. Thomas hadn't mentioned anyone coming so early. He was particular about the Undercroft, protective of it in a way that went beyond mere employment. It was his domain, his responsibility, and he didn't take that lightly. When he returned an hour later, I was still at the window, though the men had long since emerged and departed, moving with the same careful purpose they'd shown upon arrival. "Thomas," I said, not turning from the glass, "who were those men in the yard this morning?" He paused in removing his cloak, and I caught the hesitation in his movements. "What men would those be, Joan?" "The ones with your key. The ones who went into the Undercroft before you arrived." His reflection joined mine in the glass, worn and unreadable. "Ah, those. They're associates of Mr. Percy, parliamentary business. Nothing that concerns us, Thomas Percy." I knew the name, of course. He was the gentleman who had arranged for Thomas to lease the Undercroft, though I'd never met him personally. A Catholic gentleman, which in itself wasn't unusual. There were many Catholics in Parliament's service, despite the suspicions that had grown since the failed Essex rebellion 4 years prior. "They had your key," I repeated, because something about Thomas's tone didn't sit right with me. "I gave it to Percy's man yesterday," Thomas said, finally turning away from the window. "They're storing some items." "Legitimate business, Joan. Don't trouble yourself with it." But I was troubled by it, though I couldn't have said precisely why. Perhaps it was the way Thomas avoided my eyes as he spoke, or the stiffness in his shoulders that appeared whenever he was uncomfortable. We'd been married 18 years, and I'd learned to read the small signs of his unease. Over the following days, the pattern repeated itself. Men would arrive at odd hours, sometimes before dawn, sometimes in the early evening, when most honest folk were settling in for the night. They were always well dressed, always quiet, and they always carried themselves with the careful bearing of men who had something to hide. I began to keep a mental record of their comings and goings. There was the tall, lean man I'd first noticed. He seemed to be in charge, though he spoke little and never raised his voice. The shorter, broader man appeared to be some kind of craftsman, judging by his clothes and the way his hands were stained with what looked like soot or charcoal. A third man joined them frequently, middle-aged with greying hair and the soft look of someone unused to physical labour. Most concerning of all was a fourth man who appeared after a week or so. He was different from the others, harder somehow, with pale eyes that seemed to take in everything and reveal nothing. When he looked at me, the few times our paths crossed in the courtyard, I felt as though he was measuring me for something, weighing my usefulness perhaps, or my potential as a threat. "His name is Guido," Thomas told me one evening when I asked about the pale-eyed man. "Foreign, Spanish perhaps, or from the Low Countries. No one seemed quite certain. He's the one doing most of the work down there." "What kind of work requires a foreigner?" I asked. Thomas was quiet for so long, I thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he said, "The kind that requires particular skills, Joan. Skills that aren't easily found among Englishmen." That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds from below. There were voices muffled by stone and timber, but audible enough that I could catch the rhythm of conversation, if not the words themselves. More troubling were the other sounds, scraping, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. The occasional thump of something being set down with great care. And underneath it all, a smell that had begun to seep up through the floorboards. Acrid and sharp, with an undertone that caught at the back of my throat, faintly reminiscent of festival cannons, but stronger, more insistent, more wrong. But this was stronger, more concentrated, and it seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. "Thomas," I said the next morning, as he prepared to leave, "what exactly are they storing down there?" He paused with his hand on the door latch. "Supplies," he said without turning around. "For Parliament. Coal and timber and such. It doesn't smell like coal." "Joan." His voice carried a warning I'd rarely heard before. "There are things it's better not to ask about. Things that are above our station to understand. We have good work, steady pay, and a roof over our heads. That's more than most can say. Don't endanger what we have with too much curiosity." After he left, I stood in our small parlour and tried to convince myself that he was right, that I was letting my imagination run away with me, seeing mysteries where there were only mundane explanations. But the smell was getting stronger, and the sounds from below were becoming more frequent and more urgent. That afternoon, while hanging laundry in the courtyard, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the men, the craftsman with the stained hands, emerged from the undercroft, carrying what appeared to be an empty sack. But as he walked past me toward the street, I caught sight of black powder dusting the fabric and the same acrid smell that had been seeping into our rooms. Gunpowder. They were storing gunpowder beneath Parliament. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Barrels and barrels of it, judging by the smell and the careful way the men handled whatever they were moving. But why? Parliament wasn't at war. There was no siege to prepare for, no enemy at our gates that would require such quantities of explosive material. Unless, I forced myself to stop that line of thinking, there had to be a legitimate explanation. Perhaps it was for ceremonial purposes, or for the defence of London should the Spanish attempt another invasion. Perhaps Thomas was right, and these were matters too complex for someone like me to understand. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew I was lying. The furtive behaviour, the odd hours, the foreign specialist, none of it spoke to legitimate business. And as the scent of powder grew stronger, I began to realise that silence might no longer be safety, but complicity. And the way Thomas had been acting, the careful way he chose his words and avoided my eyes, told me that he knew exactly what was happening beneath our home. As October drew toward its close, the activity intensified. The men came more frequently, stayed longer, and spoke in voices that grew more urgent with each passing day. I began to notice other things too, how they always checked the street before approaching the Undercroft, how they scattered in different directions when they left, never departing as a group. Most unsettling of all were the maps. I glimpsed them one evening when the foreign man, Guido, emerged from the cellar with papers tucked under his arm. The torchlight from the entrance illuminated them just enough for me to see that they weren't ordinary documents. They showed buildings, layouts, passages, the kind of detailed drawings that would be useful for someone planning something that required precise knowledge of a structure's weaknesses. That night, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my days. I decided to see for myself what they were storing in the Undercroft. A small deception that felt enormous given the larger secrets that had been growing around us like shadows. I waited until I was certain he was well away, then retrieved the spare key to the Undercroft from its hiding place behind the loose stone in our kitchen wall. Thomas thought he was the only one who knew about it, but 18 years of marriage had taught me where he kept his important things. The morning was grey and damp, with a fog that clung to the Thames and muffled the usual sounds of the city. Perfect weather for what I was about to do, though my hands trembled as I fitted the key into the lock. The Undercroft door yielded with a long, low groan that echoed in the stillness like something waking from a dream. Beyond lay a set of stone steps descending into darkness so complete it seemed solid. I had brought a candle, but its weak light barely penetrated the gloom that rose to meet me like a living thing. The smell hit me immediately. That acrid, sharp scent I'd been breathing for weeks, but concentrated now to an almost overwhelming degree. It caught in my throat and made my eyes water, but I forced myself to continue down the steps. The Undercroft was larger than I had imagined, a vast space that extended far beyond the reach of my candle flame. The ceiling was low and supported by thick stone pillars that disappeared into the darkness like the ribs of some massive beast. But it was what occupied the space between those pillars that made me gasp and nearly drop my light. Barrels, rows upon rows, like sentinels in the dark, wooden, solid, and dreadfully still. They were different sizes, some as tall as my waist, others smaller but clearly heavy, judging by how they sat solidly on the stone floor. And all of them, I knew with sick certainty, filled with gunpowder. But that wasn't all. Scattered among the barrels were other supplies that spoke to careful, methodical planning. Coils of rope, bundles of what looked like slow match, the kind used to light cannon fuses, iron tools whose purpose I could only guess at, and in one corner a collection of items that made my blood run cold. Dark cloaks, false beards, and papers that looked like travel documents. I moved deeper into the space, my candle flame dancing with my shaking hand. The barrels bore no markings, but their arrangement was clearly deliberate. They formed rough paths through the space, as if someone had been moving among them regularly, checking them, perhaps preparing them for some specific purpose. Near the back of the undercroft, I found what appeared to be a work area. A rough table had been set up, covered with papers, maps, and tools. The maps were more detailed than what I had glimpsed before, layouts not just of Parliament, but of the surrounding streets, the positions of guards, the timing of various parliamentary sessions. It wasn't just plans, it was choreography, like a dance mapped out to the final breath. But it was the calendar that made everything terrifyingly clear. It was marked with dates and notes in a careful hand, counting down to a specific day. November 5th, the state opening of Parliament, when King James would address both houses in the chamber directly above where I now stood. The realization of what I was looking at, what I had been living above for weeks, made my legs go weak. This wasn't storage. It wasn't even theft or smuggling, which would have been bad enough. This was treason of the highest order. An attempt on the life of the king himself and every lord and member of Parliament who would gather in the chamber above. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to process the magnitude of what I had discovered. It felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes. The silence of the undercroft pressed around me, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the occasional drip of water from somewhere in the darkness. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs above. My blood turned to ice. Someone was coming down, and there was nowhere to hide among the barrels that wouldn't leave me exposed. I blew out my candle and pressed myself against one of the stone pillars, hoping the darkness would conceal me, but knowing that anyone with their own light would spot me immediately. The footsteps were careful, measured, not the hurried pace of someone checking on storage, but the deliberate movement of someone who belonged here. I heard the scrape of flint and steel, and a moment later the undercroft was illuminated by the warm glow of a lantern. It was Guido, the foreign man with the pale eyes. He moved through the space with the familiarity of long practice, checking barrels, examining the work table, making small adjustments to the arrangement of supplies. For several terrifying minutes he worked within arm's reach of where I hid, and I was certain he would discover me. But then voices called from above, Thomas's voice among them, and Guido quickly gathered up some papers from the table and headed back toward the stairs. I waited until I heard the door close above before daring to move, then made my way as quickly and quietly as possible back to the entrance. The climb back to daylight felt like emerging from hell itself. My hands shook so badly I could barely fit the key back into the lock, and when I finally reached our rooms above, I collapsed into a chair and wept with fear and confusion and a terrible, crushing sense of responsibility. What was I supposed to do with what I had learned? Who could I tell? Thomas was clearly involved, whether willingly or under duress. The local magistrates would never believe the word of a woman like me against men of higher station. And if I was wrong somehow, if there was some explanation I hadn't considered, I would be condemning my husband and destroying our lives based on suspicion and circumstance. But if I was right and I did nothing, the king would die, Parliament would be destroyed, and I would bear the weight of that knowledge for the rest of my days. When Thomas returned from church that afternoon, I watched him carefully, looking for some sign of what he truly knew, what he truly felt about the business that was occupying our cellar. But his face revealed nothing beyond the usual weariness of a man who worked hard for modest wages. "You're very quiet today," he observed, as we sat down to our simple Sunday dinner of bread, cheese, and preserved apples. "I've been thinking," I said carefully, "about what you told me, about not asking too many questions." He nodded, seeming relieved. "It's for the best, Joan. There are powerful men involved in this business, men who don't tolerate interference from people like us. The less we know, the safer we are." "But what if—" I began, then stopped myself. What if what? I looked at his weathered face, at the hands that had worked so hard to provide for us, at the eyes that had looked at me with love for 18 years. How could I tell him what I suspected? How could I ask him to choose between his safety and his conscience? "What if something goes wrong?" I finished lamely. "What if we're blamed for whatever they're doing down there?" Thomas reached across the table and took my hand. His fingers were rough with calluses, warm and familiar and reassuring. "Nothing will go wrong," he said. "And even if it did, we're just the caretakers. No one would blame us for what our betters choose to do." But even as he spoke, I could see the doubt in his eyes. He knew, as I did, that when powerful men fell, they often took everyone around them down as well. The innocent and the guilty alike were consumed when great schemes collapsed. That night, as Thomas slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds from below. They were working again, those careful, methodical men with their barrels of death and their maps of Parliament. I could hear them moving about, making final preparations for whatever they planned to do on the 5th of November. And I knew, with a certainty that felt like a weight on my chest, that I was running out of time to decide what to do about it. The 1st of November arrived with unseasonable warmth and a heaviness that made my stomach knot with dread. Mrs. Whitmore from the bakery mentioned it casually as I purchased our daily bread. The King had decided to delay the state opening of Parliament by several days due to concerns about plague in the city. "Moved it to the 5th, they have," she said, wrapping the still warm loaves in cloth. "His Majesty wants to be certain the air has cleared before gathering so many important men in one place." I thanked her and hurried home, my mind racing. The 5th of November, the very date I had seen marked on the calendar in the Undercroft. Either this was the most terrible of coincidences, or the plotters had somehow influenced the timing of the parliamentary session to suit their own purposes. When I reached our lodgings, I found Thomas in conversation with 2 men I hadn't seen before. They were better dressed than the usual visitors to the Undercroft, with the soft hands and careful speech of gentlemen. One was elderly, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. The other was younger, perhaps 40, with nervous eyes that kept darting toward the windows as if he expected to see enemies approaching. "Joan," Thomas said when he noticed me in the doorway, "these gentlemen were just leaving." But the older man stepped forward and inclined his head politely. "Mrs. Rennett, I presume?" "I am Thomas Percy. I believe your husband has mentioned me." So this was the man behind our arrangement, the Catholic gentleman who had secured Thomas's position as keeper of the Undercroft. He was smaller than I had imagined, with an unremarkable face that would be easy to forget in a crowd. But his eyes were sharp, too sharp, like glass polished smooth by secrets, and when he looked at me I felt as though he was taking my measure in some way I didn't understand. "Mr. Percy," I said, managing a slight curtsy despite my unease. "An honour to meet you at last." "The honour is mine," he replied smoothly. "Your husband speaks very highly of your discretion, a valuable quality in these uncertain times." The word discretion seemed to hang in the air between us, weighted with meaning I was meant to understand. This was a warning dressed up as a compliment. He was letting me know that my silence was expected, perhaps even required. "I've always believed that the best servants are those who see nothing and remember less," I said carefully. Percy smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Wise words, Mrs. Rennett. I hope we can count on your continued wisdom in the days to come." After they left, Thomas was unusually quiet. He moved about our small rooms with the restless energy of a man who wanted to be somewhere else, checking and rechecking things that didn't need his attention. "They seemed concerned about something," I ventured. "There are always concerns when important work is being done," Thomas replied without looking at me. "But it's nothing for you to worry about." That evening, as I prepared our supper, I noticed that the sounds from below had changed. Instead of the careful, methodical work I had grown accustomed to, there was an urgency now, a sense of final preparations being made. Voices were raised more often, though still kept low enough that I couldn't make out words. There was the sound of barrels being moved, repositioned perhaps, and the scraping of metal against stone that sent chills down my spine. Most disturbing of all was a new smell that began to seep up through the floorboards. It was different now, no longer just powder, but something damp and bitter, the scent of enclosed spaces and unfinished violence. It was the smell of men who had been working underground for too long, breathing the same stale air, handling materials that left their mark on skin and clothing. I found myself unable to eat, pushing food around my plate, while Thomas consumed his meal with mechanical efficiency. Neither of us spoke much, and when we did, our words felt hollow, inadequate to bridge the growing chasm of unspoken knowledge between us. "Thomas," I said finally, as he prepared for bed, "if something were to happen, something bad, what would you want me to do?" He paused in unlacing his boots. "What kind of something?" "I don't know. Anything. If there were trouble, if you were taken away, if I had to choose between staying silent and— Joan." His voice was sharp, cutting off my words. "There won't be any trouble. And you won't have to choose anything. Do you understand me?" But his eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of a man who knew exactly what kind of trouble might come, and who was as frightened as I was of what that might mean for us. The next day brought visitors I had never seen before, officials of some kind, judging by their dress and bearing. They didn't go to the Undercroft, but instead spent time in conversation with Thomas in our small parlour. I was banished to the kitchen, but the walls were thin and I could hear fragments of their discussion. Final preparations. If anything goes wrong, your wife knows nothing. Better for everyone if— When they left, Thomas looked as though he had aged 10 years in the space of an hour. His hands shook as he poured himself a cup of ale, and when he noticed me watching, he turned away quickly. "What did they want?" I asked. "Nothing that concerns you," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. That night I made another decision that would haunt me. While Thomas slept, I crept down to the Undercroft once more. This time I knew what I would find. But the reality was still overwhelming. The barrels had been arranged more carefully, positioned directly beneath what I calculated must be the House of Lords chamber above. Fuses had been laid out in neat coils, and I could see that holes had been drilled in several of the barrel tops, ready to receive the slow-burning matches that would carry fire to the powder. But it was what I found on the work table that made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped my candle. A letter, half finished, in a careful hand. "My lord, I advise you to devise some excuse to shift your attendance at this Parliament, for God and man hath concurred to punish the wickedness of this time." A warning letter, unmistakably, but a warning meant only for some, curated mercy, not justice. Someone was planning to warn at least one member of Parliament to stay away from the session. But who? And why would they warn some but not others? As I studied the letter more closely, trying to make out the signature, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps on the stairs above, and voices, several of them speaking in urgent, hushed tones. I blew out my candle and pressed myself against the stone wall, but there was nowhere to hide if they brought light down with them. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, and I heard the scrape of flint and steel as someone lit a lamp. "Everything is ready," a voice said. Guido, the foreign man. "The powder is in position, the fuses are laid. We need only wait for the signal, and if we're discovered..." This was a voice I didn't recognize, younger and more nervous than the others. "We won't be," said another voice, Thomas Percy. "The warning has been sent. By the time anyone thinks to search, it will be too late." "What about the caretaker and his wife?" asked the nervous voice. "They know too much." There was a pause that seemed to stretch forever. Then Percy spoke again, his voice colder than I had ever heard it. "They know only what they need to know. And after tomorrow, it won't matter what they've seen or heard. None of it will matter." The implication of his words hit me like a physical blow. They weren't planning to let Thomas and me simply walk away from this. We were witnesses, complications that would need to be dealt with once their plot was complete. I waited in the darkness, hardly daring to breathe, as they conducted their final inspection. They checked the barrels, tested the fuses, and made small adjustments to their arrangement. All the while, they spoke of tomorrow, of the King's arrival, of the moment when Parliament would gather above us, of the signal that would light the fuses and bring their terrible plan to fruition. When they finally left, I remained hidden for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, too overwhelmed by what I had learned to think clearly. But gradually, one thought began to emerge from the chaos in my mind. I had to act. Whatever the consequences, whatever the risks to Thomas and myself, I could not let this happen. I could not be complicit in the murder of the King and the destruction of Parliament. But what could I do? Who would believe me? And how could I act without destroying the man I loved? As I crept back up the stairs to our rooms, where Thomas slept peacefully, unaware that I had discovered the full extent of the horror we were living above, I knew that I had perhaps 12 hours to find answers to those questions. 12 hours to decide between my loyalty to my husband and my duty to my king and country. 12 hours to choose between love and conscience. And whatever I chose, the weight of it would follow me through every door I ever dared open again. Sleep did not come that night, not even for a moment. How could I, knowing what lay beneath our floorboards? Instead, I sat by our small window, watching the stars wheel overhead, and trying to find some solution that would save both my husband and my sovereign. By dawn, I had reached a terrible conclusion. There was no such solution. Any action I took would destroy one to save the other. The only question was which destruction I could live with. As Thomas prepared to leave for his morning duties, I made my choice. "Thomas," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." He paused in fastening his cloak. "What is it, Joan?" "I know what's in the Undercroft. I know what they're planning to do today." The colour drained from his face. For a moment, he simply stared at me, and I could see him calculating. How much I knew, how long I had known it, what I might do with the knowledge. "Joan," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "you don't understand what you're talking about. I understand that there are barrels of gunpowder beneath Parliament. I understand that they plan to light them when the King arrives for the state opening. I understand that we're meant to die with everyone else because we've seen too much." Thomas sank into a chair as if his legs would no longer support him. "How long have you known?" "Weeks. I've been down there, Thomas. I've seen the maps, the fuses, the warning letter they're planning to send. This isn't some desperate act by desperate men. This is carefully planned murder." For a long moment we sat in silence. Then Thomas buried his face in his hands. "I never wanted this," he said, his voice muffled. "When Percy first approached me, he said they only needed storage space. Legitimate supplies for legitimate purposes. By the time I realized what they were really doing, by then you were in too deep to get out," I finished. He nodded. "They made it clear that speaking out would mean death, not just for me, but for you as well. I thought if I just kept quiet, if I just did what they asked, we might survive this. But we won't, will we? Percy made that clear last night. We know too much, and dead witnesses can't testify." Thomas looked up at me, his eyes haunted. "What do you want me to do, Joan? If I go to the authorities now, they'll hang me as a traitor. If I don't, and this succeeds, they'll kill us anyway. And if I don't, and it fails? If it fails because someone warned them, we might have a chance," I said. "We might be able to claim we were coerced, that we were as much victims as anyone. You want me to betray them. I want you to save the King. I want you to save Parliament. I want you to save us." Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. Finally he said, "Even if I wanted to, it's too late. The session begins in hours. There's no time to organize a proper search, no time to remove all that powder safely. Then we have to find another way." But even as I said it, I knew there was no other way. The plot was too far advanced, the conspirators too committed. The only hope was to expose them before they could act, and that meant risking everything. After Thomas left, reluctantly, looking back at me with eyes full of fear, I sat alone in our small parlour and tried to think of what to do. I had no connections to the court, no way to reach anyone with the authority to act on such information. A woman of my station didn't simply walk up to the palace and demand an audience with the King's advisers. But then I remembered something Mrs. Whitmore had mentioned weeks ago. Her nephew worked as a clerk in the office of the Secretary of State. It wasn't much, but it was a connection, however tenuous. I put on my best dress and cloak and made my way through the narrow streets of London to the bakery. Mrs. Whitmore was surprised to see me so early, and even more surprised when I asked about her nephew. "Young William? He's a good boy, works for the government. Why do you ask?" "I need to get a message to someone in authority," I said carefully. "It's about something I've seen, something that might be important to national security." Mrs. Whitmore's eyes widened. What kind of something? I couldn't tell her the truth. She would never believe it. And even if she did, she might panic and spread word in a way that would warn the conspirators. Instead, I said, I think there might be plans to disrupt today's parliamentary session. I need someone in government to know about it. It took some convincing, but eventually Mrs. Whitmore agreed to send word to her nephew. She wrote a brief note explaining that a neighbour had information that might be important to his superiors, and dispatched her youngest son to deliver it. Then came the hardest part: waiting. I returned home to find that Thomas had not yet come back from the Undercroft. Through the floorboards, I could hear the conspirators making their final preparations. There were more voices than usual. It sounded as though the entire group had gathered for the culmination of their plot. Around midday, there came a knock at our door. My heart leaped, hoping it might be officials responding to my message, but instead I found a young man I didn't recognize. Mrs. Rennett, I'm William Whitmore, Mrs. Whitmore's nephew. She said you had information for the government. He was younger than I had expected, barely out of his teens, with the nervous energy of someone new to important work. But his eyes were intelligent, and he listened carefully as I explained what I had discovered. You're certain about this? He asked when I finished. You've actually seen gunpowder in large quantities beneath Parliament. Barrels and barrels of it, I confirmed, enough to bring down the entire building. Young Whitmore paled. I need to report this immediately. Can you show me exactly where this Undercroft is located? I led him to the courtyard and pointed out the entrance to the cellar. Even from where we stood, the acrid smell of gunpowder was noticeable. Dear God, he whispered. If you're right. I am right, I said firmly. The question is whether there's time to do anything about it. He turned to go, then paused. Mrs. Rennett, if this is true, you've likely saved the king's life and prevented a catastrophe beyond imagination. But you should know, there will be consequences for everyone involved, including your husband. I know, I said. But some things are more important than personal safety. After he left, I sat in our parlour and waited. I had done what I could. The rest was out of my hands. As the afternoon wore on, I began to hear signs of increased activity outside. More people moving through the streets, voices calling out orders, the sound of horses and carts. Something was happening, but I couldn't tell if it was normal preparation for the parliamentary session or a response to my warning. Then, just as evening was falling, Thomas burst through the door like a man outrunning his own fate, face white with a fury rooted in fear. "What have you done?" he demanded. Before I could answer, we both heard the sound of boots on cobblestones outside, many boots moving with military precision. Through our window, I could see torches approaching through the gathering dusk. "They're searching houses," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "Someone sent word to the authorities. The whole plot is unravelling." "Good," I said, though my voice shook. It needed to unravel. Thomas stared at me. "You did this." "You sent word somehow," I nodded. Not in shame, but in sorrow. There are moments that fracture a life clean in two, before truth and after. I couldn't let it happen, Thomas. I couldn't let them murder the king and destroy Parliament. Surely you understand that. But the look in his eyes told me he didn't understand, or perhaps he understood too well. I had chosen my conscience over his safety, my duty to the realm over my loyalty to him. In doing so, I had likely condemned us both. The sound of boots grew louder, and we could hear voices calling out orders in the courtyard below. They were here. Thunder wrapped in iron, heavy, authoritative, the kind of knock that brooked no delay in answering. "Open in the King's name." Thomas and I looked at each other across our small parlour. In his eyes I saw not anger now, but a kind of desperate sadness. We both knew that our old life, whatever its hardships, was ending in this moment. "Joan," he said quietly, "whatever happens now, I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. Even when I was too frightened to choose right from wrong, I never stopped loving you." Before I could respond, he opened the door. Sir Thomas Knivet, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, stood on our threshold with a company of armed men behind him. He was a stern-faced man in his 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to handling matters of grave importance. "Thomas Rennett?" he inquired, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Yes, my lord. I am here on direct orders from His Majesty's Privy Council. We have received intelligence suggesting that the premises under your care may be harbouring materials intended for use against the Crown and Parliament." I watched Thomas's face as he processed these words. He might have lied, feigned ignorance, spun a story of deceit. But he didn't. Instead, he simply stepped aside. "The Undercroft is this way, my lord," he said quietly. As we descended the stone steps, Thomas, myself, Sir Thomas, and several of his men carrying lanterns, I found myself holding my breath. Despite everything I had witnessed, part of me still hoped I might have been wrong somehow, that the barrels would contain coal or grain or anything other than what I knew they held. But the smell hit us before we reached the bottom of the stairs, that sharp, unmistakable scent of gunpowder in massive quantities. Sir Thomas stopped abruptly, his hand moving instinctively to his sword. "Dear God in heaven," he whispered. The lantern light revealed the full scope of what the conspirators had assembled. 36 barrels of silent menace, arranged with the chilling logic of destruction beneath what would have been the House of Lords chamber. Enough explosive power to reduce the entire Palace of Westminster to rubble and kill everyone within hundreds of yards. "Who else knows of this?" Sir Thomas demanded, turning to Thomas. "There are others, my lord. The men who brought the powder here, who planned this abomination. Their names." Thomas hesitated, and I could see the final battle between fear and conscience playing out on his face. Then quietly he began to recite the names: Thomas Percy, Robert Catesby, Guido Fawkes, Thomas Winter, John Wright. As he spoke, some of Sir Thomas's men were examining the barrels and the fuses that had been laid out ready for lighting. One of them, a man who seemed to know something of such matters, looked up with a pale face. "Sir Thomas, if this had been ignited during tomorrow's session—" "I know," Sir Thomas replied grimly. It was then that we heard sounds from above, running footsteps, shouts, the crash of doors being forced open. The search had expanded to our lodgings and beyond. "Mrs. Rennett," Sir Thomas said, turning to me, "I understand it was you who sent word of this plot to the authorities." "Yes, my lord." My voice was steadier than I felt. "Do you understand the gravity of what you have prevented? Had this succeeded, it would have been the single most catastrophic act of treason in our nation's history." I nodded, unable to speak. "And do you understand that your husband's involvement in this conspiracy makes him liable for charges of high treason?" "I understand, my lord. But I also hope you understand that he was coerced, threatened. He's not a traitor at heart." Sir Thomas studied Thomas for a long moment. "That will be for the courts to determine. But I will make note of your cooperation and of your wife's courage in exposing this plot." Just then, there was a commotion from the entrance above. New voices, urgent and excited. One of Sir Thomas's men appeared at the top of the stairs. "Sir Thomas!" "We've taken one of them, the foreign man, Fawkes. He was found in the adjoining cellar with slow matches and a lantern. It appears he was preparing to light the fuses." My knees weakened, the world narrowing to the width of a candle's flicker. If I had waited even a few more hours to act, if young Whitmore had been any slower in delivering my message, if the authorities had taken any longer to respond. "How close were they?" I whispered. Sir Thomas's expression was grim. "Hours, Mrs. Rennett, perhaps less. You may well have prevented the murder of the king and the destruction of our entire system of government by a matter of hours." As we climbed back up from that chamber of intended death, I felt the weight of what had almost happened pressing down on me like a physical thing. So many lives that would have been lost, so much chaos and destruction that would have followed, and at the center of it all, the terrible knowledge that I might have prevented it sooner if I had been braver, if I had acted on my suspicions weeks earlier, instead of wrestling with loyalty and fear. Back in our parlor, Sir Thomas conducted a brief questioning of both Thomas and myself. My husband answered honestly about his involvement, his initial ignorance of the plot's true nature, and his growing fear as he realized what he had become party to. I described my growing suspicions, my clandestine visits to the Undercroft, and my final decision to send word to the authorities. "Mrs. Rennett," Sir Thomas said when we had finished, "His Majesty's government owes you a considerable debt. Your actions tonight have preserved not only the king's life, but the stability of the realm itself." "And my husband?" I asked. Sir Thomas was quiet for a moment. "He will be questioned further, and his case will be reviewed by the Privy Council. His cooperation tonight and your testimony regarding the coercion he faced will be taken into account. But I cannot make promises about his ultimate fate." After the officials left, taking Thomas with them for further questioning, I sat alone in our small parlour as dawn broke over London. The city was waking to news of a plot so audacious, so potentially catastrophic, that many would struggle to believe it had been real. But I had lived above it for weeks. I had breathed the acrid air of stored gunpowder, had seen the careful maps and timing charts, had heard the conspirators planning the murder of their king. I knew better than anyone how close we had all come to disaster, and all of it, the fear, the waiting, the quiet act of warning, had changed me forever. The trials began 10 days later, but the outcome had already been written in smoke. In a kingdom where even speaking against the king could be considered treason, what mercy could be expected for men who had planned to blow him to pieces along with the entire Parliament? I attended Thomas's questioning before the Privy Council, sitting in a small chamber adjoining the Great Hall, where learned men in black robes determined the fates of those who had been swept up in the conspiracy. Thomas told his story simply and honestly, how he had been approached by Percy with what seemed legitimate business, how the true nature of the plot had been revealed to him gradually, how fear for our safety had kept him silent even as his conscience screamed against what was happening. Lord Salisbury, the king's chief minister, listened with the patience of a man accustomed to unravelling complex political schemes. When Thomas finished, he turned to me. "Mrs. Rennett, your husband claims that you discovered this plot through your own observation and initiative. Is this accurate?" "Yes, my lord." I began to suspect something was wrong because of the smells, the strange visitors at odd hours, the way my husband was acting, when I finally went down to see for myself. "You took considerable risk in exposing this conspiracy. A lesser woman might have chosen to remain silent, to protect her own interests. I couldn't have lived with myself, my lord, knowing what I knew and doing nothing about it. Lord Salisbury nodded slowly. The King has been made aware of your actions, Mrs. Rennett. His Majesty is grateful for your loyalty and courage. In the end, Thomas was sentenced to 6 months in the Tower, a remarkably lenient punishment for someone so closely involved in the plot. The fact that he had been coerced, that he had cooperated fully with the investigation, and that his wife had been instrumental in exposing the conspiracy all weighed in his favour. The other conspirators were not so fortunate. Guido Fawkes, who had been found with the means to ignite the powder, was subjected to torture to reveal the names of his accomplices. Robert Catesby, the apparent leader of the plot, was killed resisting arrest. Those who survived to trial were sentenced to the traditional punishment for treason, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. I did not attend their executions. I had seen enough of death and violence to last several lifetimes. While Thomas served his sentence, I supported myself by taking in sewing and laundry. It was hard work, but honest work, and I found a strange peace in the rhythm of mending and cleaning. The government provided a small pension in recognition of my service to the Crown, which helped keep me from true poverty. Worse than the waiting or the whispers was the isolation, heavy as a shroud. Word of our involvement in the Gunpowder Plot had spread through our neighbourhood, and while some viewed me as a hero who had saved the King, others saw us as traitors who had harboured enemies of the state. Children threw stones at our windows. Former friends crossed the street to avoid speaking to me. I learned that suspicion, once aroused, is not easily laid to rest. But there were also letters of support from unexpected quarters. Gentlemen I had never met wrote to express their gratitude for my actions. Ladies of higher station than myself sent small gifts and words of encouragement. Most surprisingly, I received a brief note written in an elegant hand and sealed with the royal arms, a personal message from Queen Anne herself, thanking me for my loyalty and courage. Thomas was released from the Tower on May 5th, 1606, exactly 6 months after the plot would have been carried out. He was thinner, greyer, marked by his time in that grim fortress, but his eyes held a clarity they had lacked before his imprisonment. Whatever internal struggle between fear and conscience had tormented him during those weeks before November 5th had been resolved. "I should have listened to you sooner," he said on his first night home. "I should have trusted your judgment instead of my fear." "We both did what we thought was right at the time," I replied. "What matters is that we found our way to the truth in the end." He nodded, but I could see that he would carry the weight of his initial compliance with the conspirators for the rest of his life. Some mistakes, even when redeemed, leave permanent scars.
You've been listening to The Sleeping Archive. Sleep well. History will wait.